The U.S. Helicopter Safety Team analyzed 10 years of U.S. fatal helicopter accident data from 2009 to 2018. UIMC is the third highest fatal occurrence category and accounts for 15% of all fatal crashes. It is significant to realize that helicopter pilots have 1/3 the time to recognize, respond, and recover from an encounter with IMC than fixed-wing pilots. Over a 12-year period, the U.S. helicopter industry has tragically suffered 40 fatal UIMC crashes with the loss of 98 lives. Ladies and gentlemen, this is unacceptable. UIMC crashes are 100% preventable. Please listen carefully to our team as they share information which will help each one of us avoid UIMC.
It's better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground. We all know this common adage, but do we understand the true value of this statement as it pertains to helicopter flight in poor weather? Beyond the basics of pre-flight planning, a critical step is to have established personal weather minimums and to adhere to these before making the decision to take off. Many factors should be used to help determine our weather minimums. Pilot experience, local weather patterns, and terrain are certainly high on my list. My personal minimums include ceiling, visibility, and wind. Other factors could include gust spread, density altitude, and temperature dew point. As a pilot who falls into personal and private sector of general aviation, I quickly realized that many of the safeguards which help keep commercial pilots out of harm's way are not readily available to me. I may not have an FAA-approved flight operations manual or a formalized SMS, but I do have the desire to be the safest pilot possible. So I've developed my own safeguards. I always obtain a standard weather briefing, file a VFR flight plan for cross-country flights, request flight following when able, and I use technology such as ForeFlight to provide real-time information in flight. While this may sound foreboding, it is actually very easy to manage. The LIDO system available through 1-800-WX-BRIEF allows me to file, open, and close flight plans without speaking to anyone. This is available through my mobile device. My final safeguard, I always ask myself, how much of my ego is involved in this decision to fly?
I've been a helicopter pilot for over 50 years. And I find it interesting that during this time, the helicopter community has never settled on a consensus for what a pilot should do when they suddenly punch into the clouds. The airplane community has always relied on variations of the 4 C's: control, climb, course, and communicate. And many helicopter instructors teach this. However, when adapted to the world of helicopters, the inherent instability of the helicopter makes getting past the first C, control, almost impossible. Some instructors recommend a 180-degree turn to exit the clouds. But think about this. A standard rate turn, 3 degrees per second, will take 60 seconds, a full minute, to turn 180 degrees. That's a long time, and maintaining control, airspeed, and altitude during the turn is going to be very difficult. Other instructors teach to immediately initiate a climb. Great, but you still have to get past that first C. And then what are you supposed to do? Finally, a technique that has gathered more supporters the last few years is to enter an auto rotation. The thinking being it's a very stable form of helicopter flight and the fastest way to exit the clouds. However, the wide variation in helicopter types, instruments available, and most importantly, the disparity in pilot training and proficiency makes each of these choices debatable, hence the lack of a consensus. I frequently hear during a private or commercial pilot practical test, when posed with an unintended IMC scenario, the applicant declares they're going to trust the instruments. Sounds so simple, so non-threatening. Just trust the instruments, they'll get you home. Nothing could be further from the truth. As 56 seconds to live so clearly shows, in most cases, you're dead. Finally, The helicopter community is beginning to focus on the most important aspect of unintended flight into instrument conditions: avoidance. Don't fly into the damn clouds in the first place. There are 3 stages to the avoidance process. First is the decision to take off. The "I'll just give it a try" or "just take a look" thinking is that first step on the road to a disaster. Second is what we used to call en route decision points. But the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team's Safety Enhancement 127 uses the term trigger, which I like much better because it connotates action. The safety enhancement defines these as a predetermined set of conditions that trigger a decision during the flight. Think of them as a caution or a warning light on your instrument panel. The 3 most useful triggers are location, airspeed, and altitude. Location: a point where the weather is forecasted to deteriorate, a point where diversion to a nearby airport is easy, or a point where the terrain becomes more challenging, such as the mountains, desert, and over water. Airspeed: a reduction of 30 knots from cruise is a good rule of thumb. Whether you're in your car or in a helicopter, what do you do when the visibility is getting worse and worse? You slow down. So in flight, if the visibility decreases to a point where you have to slow more than 30 knots from cruise, that's the trigger. But no less than VY, best rate of climb speed. VY is the bottom of the power required curve. So if you allow the helicopter to slow below VY, you begin to move up the backside of the power required curve, which requires more power, not less. Altitude: I think a minimum altitude of 300 feet AGL during the day and 500 feet at night works well. The final stage of the avoidance process is land the damn helicopter. I've had a number of occasions in my career where I've landed the damn helicopter. Once in a field, once in a parking lot, and once on the median between the north-south lanes of Interstate 15. I just waited until the weather improved, which one time was more than a couple of hours. But I landed and lived. Sure, there are certainly complications to deal with when you land the damn helicopter. The police wanting an explanation, upset passengers, perhaps the press asking questions, to name a few. But look at the possible alternative. So land and live. Don't worry about an enforcement action. It's not going to happen. Of course, there will always be instances where pilots press on and eventually punch into the weather. My advice at this point is to take your hands off the controls, place your palms together, fingers pointed upward, underneath your chin, because you now have 56 seconds to live. Better to spend these precious seconds saying goodbye to loved ones or greeting your maker. Seriously, what should one do if they inadvertently find themselves IMC? Bruce Webb from AIRBUS has by far and away the best advice I've ever heard, because he focuses not just on the helicopter and the controls, but more importantly, on you. To quote Bruce, we all have a limited mental capacity, and this situation will require all of it. And finally, remember the 10th commandment from my 10 commandments for flying a helicopter. Let infinite wisdom govern thy decisions in flight, lest on the morrow thy family weeps for thee.
My portion in this discussion should be considered the absolute last resort. What to do if your only option is to continue flight IMC. Landing is impossible, but so is maintaining VFR flight. Imagine that you are the pilot of a VFR helicopter in extremely poor weather. You are perilously low over inhospitable terrain with no autopilot, no co-pilot, no help. And turning back or landing is no longer an option. The clock has begun. We all have limited mental capacity, and this situation will require all of it. You must clear your mind. Push aside the regrets of past decisions because none of that matters now. You must remain in the present and focus entirely upon flying the helicopter. It is critically important that you enter the clouds in a controlled manner. You're not a passenger. You control the helicopter and your fate. So while you still have some visual cues, place the helicopter in straight and level flight. Make no rapid or large flight control inputs and begin your scan. Attitude, airspeed, attitude, altitude. You must remain on the instruments. Be still in your seat. Do not move your head about unnecessarily. Such movements will only aggravate your vestibular system and lead to spatial disorientation. Scan the instruments with your eyes and resist the temptation to look back outside. Once you are stabilized with an airspeed at approximately VY, take a deep breath, add a small amount of power to begin a climb. You choose when and how to enter the clouds. After you've established yourself in a controlled climb, consider relaxing your hand on the collective. If the collective has sufficient friction to maintain its placement, I find it easier to control the helicopter without additional collective inputs while IMC. Turns should be made only if absolutely necessary. Otherwise, climb straight ahead until you reach VMC. If the cloud tops are above an altitude which you can achieve, then you may need to maneuver while IMC. Once you are VMC or feel 100% confident that you can divert a portion of your attention to the radio, tune it to 121.5 and declare an emergency. Flying the helicopter must remain your highest priority. Do not become distracted by the radio or feel compelled to comply with the instructions given on the radio if they interfere with your ability to control the helicopter. These first 56 seconds are absolutely critical. It is possible that you'll pop out on top and be able to fly to a location where you can descend and land under VMC. But if not, you're now in a position to receive help and locate and execute an instrument approach to a nearby airport. None of this should be considered a backup plan. These are last resort actions. Making conservative decisions before flight is the most effective way to avoid such deadly situations. If you find yourself in a situation which is completely unacceptable, land. Land and live. Do not continue and allow the situation to evolve into an extremely dangerous 56-second emergency. The outcome is entirely too predictable.